And welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our last book talk of the month of August from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Today we are featuring George Hayward and his book, The Party Dolls, which looks at, I want to say, a daring escape from a Vietnam Hanoi Hilton prison camp. I'm not sure that daring is quite the word that George would use, and perhaps I'm off there. But we are happy to have George here today with us. It should be a great talk. But before we get started, I would just like to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support, and in particular, their executive director, Ms. Jennifer Carlson. They do a fantastic job in bringing these free virtual programs to our museum community, which is rather large right now. It spans the entire globe. And so that's exciting for us, and that's why we're going to continue to do these virtual programs for you moving into the future, even though the museum is open. And we would love to see you come out and enjoy the museum. And also, I would like to say thank you to our sponsor as well, Generac Power Systems. They've been a fantastic sponsor, and we are just so fortunate to have them on board with us for our virtual programming. Like I said, we are happy to have George Hayward with us today, who's going to be talking about his newest work, The Party Dolls. And just once again, if I could just remind everybody, if you have any questions for the author, please be sure to submit them via the chat function, and we will get those up at the end of the presentation, and the author will definitely answer everybody's questions. I'm going to stop talking now because nobody came to hear me. We are all here to talk with George today. George, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, folks.
No problem. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to turn the floor over to you. You can go ahead and start your screen sharing now with your PowerPoint presentation.
Awesome.
And I am just going to step away, and the floor is yours, sir.
Boom. And if I do this right, we should see. I got to get rid of this. Hold on. I'm stuck in some sort of screen here. Somehow got my screen sharing thing is stuck at the top of my screen and I can't get rid of it. We just tested this 5 minutes ago. What happened?
We certainly did.
There we go. There we go. All right. All right. So, hi, folks. My name is George Hayward, and today I'm going to give you an overview of my book, The Party Dolls, which is the true tragic story of two Americans' attempted escape from a 1969 Hanoi POW camp. Eric mentioned he called it daring. That was not an overstep, Eric. This is an extremely daring. Whether it was ill-advised or tragic is debatable, but it was certainly daring. So let's dive right in. On May 10th, 1969, after more than a year of planning, two American POWs escaped from a Hanoi prison called the Annex. They were recaptured the next day. One of them died in torture, and dozens more Americans in that camp and the one adjoining to it suffered in the weeks that followed. Now, what I just said is pretty much all that's been known about this escape, which was codenamed The Party. If you ask Vietnam POWs, if you ask military historians, almost nobody knows anything more than that. The story has largely been untold for the last 50 years. So who am I and why am I the man to write it? Well, my background is journalism. I have the bad distinction of having majored in journalism at two different universities. Also spent most of my adult career in public relations, done some freelance journalism along the way, and written a couple books. I was active duty Air Force, enlisted from 1987 to 1999. And for most of that time, I was a military journalist. From 1990 to 1992, I was stationed at what was then called Falcon Air Force Base, just outside Colorado Springs. It is now the much larger Schriever Space Force Base, but back then it was a little tiny space operations center, 4 buildings and a fence line, Falcon Air Force Station. And my boss there was a civilian, civil service, retired colonel, retired fighter pilot, former POW, Bill Baugh, who was one of John Dramisi and Ed Atterbury's cellmates at the time of the escape. And he used to do a lot of public speaking then. He was quite the sought after speaker in the community for various luncheons, military events, rotaries, Lions clubs, that sort of thing. And he would tell his experiences as a POW, kind of his life story, but there was always a chapter in it about the escape. And the escape always fascinated me. The moral conflict, the ambiguities and the directives that I'll lay out for you. This was not a patriotic red, white, and blue, wave the flag, I love my country story. This is a dark, painful tale with conflict and questions. So I started then collecting information for the book. And as the years went by, I finished my Air Force time, 1998, 1999, as a staff writer for Airman Magazine, which was at the time a full color monthly magazine, the Air Force's flagship publication. And I was able to do a little bit more digging around on the story then. So, but it was a long road to the book. I started in the mid 90s, as I mentioned, collecting interviews through my time at Airman Magazine and through a PR early 2000s and a PR career after I got out. But over that time, I did 15 interviews with 9 POWs who were either involved directly or indirectly with the planning of the escape, including Wisconsin native Don Heiliger. The big thing is I saved these interviews to cassette tape. And the picture there on the screen, you can see a little box with all those cassette tapes. And then under that, binders and other material. All this material has sat on my desk or around my desk for 20 years. But when I first collected it all in the early 2000s, I made my first attempt to write the book. And I tried to do it as a dramatization, a fictional story, if you will. I took all the facts I had, everything the POWs had told me, and I started weaving it together. And there were a lot of holes in the narrative. There were conflicting memories. So where things didn't match up, I just made it up. And about 4 or 5 chapters into the book, it just started to fall apart. I was stalling between fact and fiction and conflicting memories of the men involved. And the project just kind of stalled out. And then life took over for 15 years. Moved on to another project, career, family, kids, until finally late 2017, I came back at the project at my wife's urging and started to attack it in a new way, as a factual narrative. I took all the interviews I had done, all the material I had collected, and collated it together to piece together the true story of what happened. And when I was done putting that together, I went back and I coordinated it with the POWs who were still alive from my previous interviews. Of the 9 men I had interviewed, only 4 were still alive. And so I ran it back through them, and they coordinated it with other POWs who added more information to it. And finally, I had a book. So I spent, this 2018, I spent about a year or so pitching it, trying to find an agent or a publisher who would pick up the story. And much to my shock and disappointment, of course, I'm very biased about this, but I found no one who would pick up the story. So I started the process of self-publishing, and here we are now. And according to every POW who has read this, according to a couple historians who have read it, this is the most complete and accurate account of the Atterbury-Dramisi escape that's ever been compiled. So I mentioned Don Heiliger, Wisconsin man himself, former board member of this museum. So I'm sure many people here know who he is. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2016 before I started the serious work on this book. Oops, I kind of missed there we go. There's Don. But as we know, he's got Madison roots. His family are with us today. He's a University of Wisconsin Badger. He served multiple terms after his military career on the Dane County Board of Supervisors. He served for the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. A distinguished gentleman, a true community servant, a true man of the people. He's also a pretty distinguished guy. He was a U.S. Air Force F-105 pilot and not your run-of-the-mill pilot. He was one of only 25 F-105 pilots who were trained for all-weather combat missions during Vietnam. This was an elite group. They were called Ryan's Raiders after the Air Force Chief of Staff at the time, General Ryan, who I believe it was his idea to come up with this. So he was shot down May 15th, 1967. He was on a bombing run north of Hanoi. He was captured and went through what the POWs all call the pipeline, where it takes them days, even weeks, to get from where they were captured all the way to Hanoi as they're paraded through towns and hidden at night, and during the day put on display, beaten and whatnot. The next quote, starting with meticulous, I'll read it. Meticulous, good with numbers and dates, and an overall nice guy liked by his cellmates. When I introduce him in the Party Dolls, that's how I describe him, and that is using the words of his cellmates. He was a captain when he was captured. He retired as a colonel, and his flight suit, and I believe some of his other memorabilia are part of the Veterans Museum collection. So that's Don Heiliger, and he's a key element of the story. In fact, in the book, he is quoted quite extensively. So now that I've kind of told you who I am and why we're here and how I came across the story, let's start putting you there. Okay. This is a map of Hanoi in 1967, Vietnam era. At the time, there were some estimates over 600 American POWs spread among several POW camps in and around Hanoi. And the escape occurred from one called the Zoo, or actually it was called the Annex. The Vietnamese name of the prison was Kuloak. And when we zoom in on it in a little bit, you'll see that it's a multi-sectioned complex. The Zoo was the original prison. The Annex was an extension of it that the Vietnamese opened a year or two later after the Zoo. And that's why the Americans named it the Annex. In fact, at first they didn't realize it was still part of the Zoo. Okay. This map, by the way, is important. This map was illustrated by U.S. Navy captain and former POW, John Michael McGrath. He goes by Mike. Now, Mike is a key player in this whole story. He was not in the cell with Dramisi and Atterbury and Heiliger and Baugh. He was in the cell next door. But back when I first started putting the story together, he lived here in Colorado Springs and still does, in fact. But he was president of Pows, the National Association of Vietnam POWs. And he was key in helping connect me to all kinds of sources of information, just other POWs, just a key critical factor in this. Okay. And even to this day, he's still on Pows board of directors, and he is their official historian. And he's also an author and an illustrator himself. He illustrated this map and he did the cover art for the book. And he also has his own book called Prisoner of War that he wrote and illustrated himself. And he helped me get permission to use several of his illustrations from his book in mine. So now that we've got you in Hanoi, let's zoom in. This is Kuloak Prison, also known as the Zoo/Annex. On the left, as you can see, the complex is divided into three distinct sections. On the left, that is the Zoo. Now, the Zoo was a French movie studio when the French ruled Vietnam for decades, okay? And the middle section, we believe, or the POWs believed, was a storage area for the studio. And then the section on the right, years later, was where the Vietnamese prison staff and guards all stayed and worked. But the Annex opened in 1967, October 67, after the Zoo had been open for at least a year before that. And when the prisoners were first brought over to the Annex, they didn't know where they were going. They just knew it was close by. But the entire complex, all three parts of it, even though they were separate, they were all walled off, 10-foot walls. They were topped by electric wire, barbed wire, and this really clever deterrent, I guess. What the Vietnamese did was they topped the wall with concrete and then they embedded broken glass. Like if you just took a barrel of broken bottles, smashed them all up, and then embedded that glass into the concrete. Quite a good barrier. You'll notice in the Annex is a 6-building complex there, kind of shaped like a bracket. The 4 buildings on the left in a row were the 4 buildings that housed Americans. There were 9 men to a cell, 2 cells to each one of those buildings. The Americans numbered the cells starting from the bottom left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can see the red 6, I notate 1 room there. That's the room that the actual escape took place from. Within those rooms, as I said, there were 9 men to each cell. Each cell was about 20 feet by 18 feet. They slept on wooden pallets on the floor. They had mosquito nets. They had a blanket and not much else. Their bathroom was 4 buckets in the room, no privacy whatsoever, poor ventilation. You can only imagine what it smelt like, 9 men in a pent-up cell in an open toilet. But during the Vietnam War, there were roughly 72 Americans held in those 4 buildings right there. Now, what's most noteworthy about this was the Vietnamese held their highest value prisoners at the Hanoi Hilton, a few miles away. They held the higher ranking prisoners in the zoo and annex in the zoo. The annex prisoners had all shared something in common. They were all air crew. They were all either pilots or fighter backseaters or bomb crews or helicopter crews, but they were all lower ranking. The highest ranking man in the entire place was a captain. And almost all of them were captains. Air Force captain is equal to a Navy lieutenant. And they were all Air Force captains, Navy lieutenants, with the exception of a few Air Force lieutenants and enlisted people as well. So, room 6, the escape room. This is what Mike McGrath calls the lineup. You see Bill Baugh there, my old boss, Don Heiliger. Right below them is Laurie Lengel, who grew up a few miles from where I grew up in the Boston area. Off in the far right bottom corner, there's Ed Atterbury. All of these men I interviewed back in the day, except for Red Wilson and Ed Atterbury. They were both dead, obviously. Wilson died of cancer back in the 1980s, before I even knew of this story. So what's interesting about this is all of these men, all pilots or air crew. Meyer was the only one who was not actually a pilot. He was a backseater. He was an electronic warfare officer. If you've seen Top Gun, he was Goose. All of these men were, I guess, networked. The fighter pilot network was like a little brotherhood. They all knew each other or had been stationed together or were 1 degree of separation from each other, and they all knew each other, except Ed Atterbury. He was kind of off in his own world. He had never met any of them before, except Laurie Lengel. They had been stationed together during training time before their deployments to Vietnam. And there's an important reason for this I'll get to shortly, because it's a key element of the story. But all of these guys were put together. They were all Air Force captains in the same room. Now, the first thing, when you get a group of military people together, the first thing they'll do is figure out who's in charge. Who's the highest ranking person, and that person is in charge. Now, if everyone's the same rank, it becomes your date of rank when you were promoted to captain, for instance. And in a POW situation, the POWs had a rule, and I'm actually unclear whether this was military policy or POW policy that had been put out while they were captured. But the policy was your date of rank at shoot down. And this is important because when each of these men were captured, they were all captains. However, Bill Baugh and John Dramisi had been selected for promotion to major, but had not yet been promoted. And if you know how the military promotion system works, that makes sense. Once a year, the Air Force will announce, these are all the people that got promoted from captain to major. But they stagger those promotions out over the course of a year based on seniority as a captain. So the most senior captains get promoted first, and then once a month more get promoted until 12 months from now, the least senior captain would put on major. However, the POWs had a rule, date of rank at shoot down, meaning no matter when they would have been majors, in the annex, they stayed captains, okay? So who's gonna be in charge of this room? Well, Red Wilson was the senior ranking captain by date of rank at shoot down. However, it was clear to most everyone in the room right out of the get-go when they got together that he didn't really want the responsibility, but John Dramisi did. John Dramisi wanted to be in charge. So after some internal debate, essentially they broke the rules themselves and let John Dramisi be the SRO, the senior ranking officer of room 6. That made him their commander, and the first thing he started talking about was escape. So let's talk about John Dramisi. You notice his date of death there, September 17th, 2017. That was ironically, literally a couple of weeks before I actually seriously started writing this book. And when I found that out after the fact, that rather saddened me. But he was born in Philadelphia. He was raised in New Jersey. He was the son of a boxer. He wrestled at Rutgers University. And there's just no other way to say it. He was just a tough nut. He was strong, physically strong, mentally strong. And when I interviewed him in 1999, at 66 years old, he was built like a college gymnast, narrow at the waist, barrel chested, muscular. Just no one could question this man's toughness. He was an F-105 pilot. He was shot down April 1st, 1967. And by all accounts, from the moment he was shot down, he resisted his captors. He exchanged gunfire with them even before he was captured, and he was captured after he got shot in the leg. And even after that, when they were moving him through the pipeline to Hanoi, he attempted to escape there. Every single POW who ever met him will attest to his courage, no matter what they thought of him personally. Brave, incredibly brave, tough man. And his record showed it. You see there, he had 2 Air Force crosses. Military people know what that means. The Air Force Cross is second only in precedence to the Medal of Honor. And this man won it twice. In fact, he was one of only 4 Air Force men ever to win more than 1 Air Force Cross. He also had 3 Legions of Merit and a Silver Star. Big deal medals that military people are sitting here watching me nodding their heads. 5 Purple Hearts kind of speaks for itself. I think everybody knows what a Purple Heart is. The photo on the right there is actually a fairly famous POW story. Many people don't realize it was John Dramisi, but he gained renown after they were released for during their captivity. He sewed an American flag out of bits of thread that he got from clothing from his fellow POWs and God knows where else. And he made that flag. This was after the escape, but he made that flag, kept it, and smuggled it out when they were all released. And that flag actually got a little notoriety. If you Google the POW US flag, you'll see pictures of him with Richard Nixon with it and all kinds of, it's all over the place. He was quite known for it. He was a captain when he was captured. He retired as a colonel. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And as I mentioned, he was as smart, intellectually and mentally tough as he was physically tough. But the next quote says a lot. It says he was opinionated and hard to like. Just like I wrote about Don Heiliger, that was kind of the consensus of his cellmates. He did not get along with anyone. And the ones who knew him from previous assignments, I don't even go into half the stuff they said about him in the book. He seemed to have trouble wherever he went, seemed to have trouble getting along with anyone wherever he went. But again, you cannot question the man's courage or determination. And in fact, he has his own book called Code of Honor. It's been out of print for a couple decades, but I bought a copy from him and he signed the inside cover for me. And that little note to me there is what he wrote there. And you can read, it says, a good soldier is aware of the cause and willing to make the necessary sacrifices. And I put that as a contrast to the opinionated and hard to like, because it says a lot. Okay, you can see a contrast there between how people could see him and how he presents himself. And he was a senior ranking officer in room 6, and the first thing on his mind was escape. And as you can see, it was not the first time he did. So let's move on to the second topic of major conflict in this story, the U.S. Code of Conduct for POWs during the Vietnam War. American POWs had a 6-article code of conduct they were expected to follow while they were captive. Articles 3 and 4 are the ones that are really pertinent to this story. I'm going to read them to you. Article 3, if I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. I will make every effort to escape and aid others to escape. I will accept neither parole nor special favors from the enemy. Now, Article 4. If I become a prisoner of war, I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners. I will give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades. If I am senior, I will take command. If not, I will obey the lawful orders of those appointed over me and will back them up in every way. So here is the innate conflict of the book. If one man, the commander, says, I'm escaping and you're obligated to help me, and the rest of them know you're bound to fail. Once you get over the wall, you're in the middle of Hanoi. Where are you going to go? And all of us are going to be tortured horribly in the aftermath. Who's right? The man escaping or the man who's not keeping faith and taking part in action which might be harmful to his comrades? Who is right is a central question in this entire story. So, moving on. The image on the left, the little sketch there, that was a little map provided to me by another one of the POWs, Porter Halliburton. He was in room 2 during all of this. I flipped it upside down so it would align with the previous image I showed you of the annex, and you can see the 8 rooms there. Room 5, next to room 6, was home to Captain Conrad Troutman, Air Force Captain Connie Troutman. He was, after many months, they figured out, the senior ranking captain in the entire annex. He was older than the other guys. He was in his 40s when the rest of them were in their late 20s or early 30s. He was a lifetime military man. He enlisted in World War II. He got his commission. He flew fighter pilots in Korea and has a career of honorable military service. Okay. Of course, the guys in room 6 didn't know this when they first got together in room 6. The first thing they knew was after organizing themselves and establishing Dramisia's SRO, they needed to establish communications with the other cells. Now, the primary way Americans communicated in Vietnam was what is called tap code. And I don't have an illustration for it here, but I can explain it to you in a very, very simple concept. Take the alphabet and take a 5x5 grid. 5 rows, 5 columns, put the alphabet in that grid and skip the letter K because you can use C for that, okay? That's 25 letters, 25 spaces. Now, an A is represented by 2 taps. First row, first letter, tap, tap, that's an A. The American POWs learned to communicate cell to cell, tapping on walls or whatever else that way. They could hold entire conversations, write sentences, introduce themselves to each other. It was not a fast or easy process whatsoever. The great thing about the tap code was there are other ways you could communicate it. That same A could be communicated with a cough. First row, first letter, A. It could also be, they could do it by blocking light. I'll see if I can do this with the light in front of me. No, that doesn't work. But if you block a light, flash it back and forth. You can communicate that way. You could tap the code in cadence while you're sweeping your floor. There were many ways to communicate cell to cell. And it was around this time when guys in room 6 were establishing communications with room 5, and room 5 was establishing communications with other cells. And they figured out that Connie Troutman was a senior guy in the entire camp and in the cell adjoining him. Over on your right in that image there too, there's a photo of, I already mentioned Mike McGrath, Navy captain, former POW. He was Troutman's roommate in room 5, and he also had a particular role. Every cell, they could pass notes to each other under certain circumstances, always secretively. They didn't want to get caught, but every cell had a designated note writer, the guy that could write in the tiniest, most legible print. And Mike was Connie Troutman's note writer too. So he had a key front row seat to the whole thing. Around this time, the POWs established a note drop between rooms 5 and 6, a place where they didn't have to use tap code, where they could literally leave notes between each other. And where they did this, I'm gonna see if I can get my mouse here. There's my mouse on the screen. There was a court, each cell had a courtyard. And you can see it says wash area, wash area, wash area, wash area. Each cell had a walled off courtyard. And once a day, the men were let out into the courtyard to wash their clothes. And there was an outhouse there and a well. And that was about it. It was their only chance at sunlight for the day. But the courtyard between cells was separated by a brick wall. And the POWs figured out if they dug out the space, the mortar between bricks, they could create a space where they could leave notes for each other. Room 5 and room 6 could leave notes for each other in that wall. When room 5 went outside, they put the note in the wall. When they go back in, room 6 gets let out, they retrieve the note from the wall. So that became their note drop. As soon as room 5 and room 6 got their note drop together, John Dramisi asked Connie Troutman for permission to form an escape committee to plan the possibility of getting out of the camp. Troutman gave him permission to form 2 plans. One, a plan for the entire camp, that if the war really started to go bad, or say sometime a bombing raid, an American bombing raid blew a hole in the wall, or the Vietnamese suddenly started mass executing people, they wanted a plan that the entire camp could kind of rise up and get out. But they also wanted a plan that any individual could do. Any cell could have a plan to break out. So Troutman gave Dramisi permission to form an escape committee within his cell to look at ways to break out of the camp. And it didn't take long for them to realize that, and I'm fast forwarding here a little bit. In fact, we'll just go ahead and jump forward. Here we go. It didn't take them long to realize that they needed two things. They needed exact conditions. They needed a rainy Saturday night with a power outage. And the escape had to be 2 men. And the reason for 2 men, and this was per their survival school training, was that 1 man, if he gets hurt, he's screwed. He's dead. He can't make it. Any more than 2 men, now you start running into the logistics and the likelihood of getting caught. The more people, more noise, more supplies, more process, more likely you're going to get exposed. The rainy Saturday night and the power outage was because in the annex, the prisoners had realized that the regular guards had 1 day off. It was Sunday. In the summertime, you had thunderstorms in Hanoi that would knock out the power all over the camp, and you could almost count on it, Bill Baugh used to say. So if you had a power outage on Saturday night and substitute guards on Sunday morning who didn't know the men as well, you could probably sneak out of the camp during the power outage. The substitute guard wouldn't notice you were gone on Saturday, and you'd have until Monday morning to get a head start and be gone. So beyond that, they needed a way out, and it really didn't take them long to figure out it was actually fairly easy to get out of their cell. They could boost a man into the attic, which was the vents into the attic were covered by barbed wire, but they could work that free using their fingers and spoon over weeks and months. And then once they got into the attic, the roof tiles were old clay tiles that were wired in place, and by twisting the wires underneath, you could move them, and now you're up onto the roof. And from there was only a process of how do you get over the wall. And once you're over the wall, you're in Hanoi, and now you can try to get away. And for that, they would need supplies and disguises. So through the summer of 1968, Dramisi and his cellmates started planning an escape for 2 men that would go up through the ceiling, through the roof, over the wall, into Hanoi, and then east towards the Red River. They would disguise themselves and try to blend in with the crowd, and they would spend all this time amassing supplies for months until they got their exact conditions, their rainy Saturday night with a power outage. Now, I mentioned the 2-person escape. John Dramisi needed a volunteer to go with him. At first, Laurie Langell volunteered, but he pulled his volunteer duty or status shortly thereafter when he realized, as he said, Dramisi wasn't planning an escape that any room could use. Dramisi was planning an escape for himself. But soon thereafter, Dramisi recruited Ed Atterbury for the job to go with him. Now, one of the criteria for the POWs was they couldn't be big men. Both Dramisi and Atterbury were short, 5'6", close to the height of the Vietnamese people. Okay. For instance, Bill Baugh was 6'4", Al Meyer was 6'2". They couldn't go. But the bottom line is Atterbury was the only one who was willing to go, and Dramisi talked him into it. Now, Atterbury was an RF-4 pilot, R being reconnaissance. Okay. He wasn't a fighter combat pilot. He flew to take pictures of any enemy activities and formations. He was born in March 1934 in Texas, a town, I think it was near Killeen. He was a laid-back Texan. All of his roommates described him as. What differentiated him from his cellmates was they were all commissioned through college. They basically ROTC, then pilot school. Ed Atterbury was more of a working class guy. He had been an enlisted Marine. He was a Marine before he was Air Force, and an enlisted guy, a grunt. And he also worked as an electrical worker, a telephone lineman up on climbing the poles and fixing the lines in the hot desert, hot Texas sun. But most importantly, I mentioned all the other guys are fighter pilots. He was a spy pilot. His entire career, he had flown spy planes. During the Cold, he had done a couple tours in Europe, flying Cold War missions, spying on Soviet military stuff and their Cold War satellites. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he did overflights of Cuba. His entire career, he had flown spy planes, and that was why none of the other fighter pilots really knew him, didn't know him. Laurie Langell met him at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho when they were both qualifying for the F4 before going to Vietnam. By the way, the two images here, the first one shows Atterbury on the right at Mountain Home prior to his deployment. We don't know who the guy on the left is. That was quite possibly his backseater for that particular training mission. And then the image on the right is a newspaper photo I actually purchased online of Atterbury after his capture. So Ed Atterbury was kind of an enigmatic man. None of his cellmates really knew anything about him. There's only really one story Laurie Langell was able to relate about him from their time at Mountain Home. And everyone just kind of described him as a quiet, pleasant, easy to get along with, but very just laid back Texan. So as summer is rolling through into the winter of 1968 and into the spring of 1999, Atterbury and Dramisi are planning their escape. They're amassing supplies. And when I say amassing supplies, for instance, they used their rice mats that they slept on to weave the conical hats that many Asian people wore. They made surgical masks out of pieces of cloth because many people wore surgical masks even back then, pre-COVID. They took a lot of steps to prepare for this escape. And they had the help of their cellmates. Their cellmates were helping them, but there was a lot of conflict. As Bill Ball once put it, he said the attitude was kind of, if these guys are going to escape and we're screwed anyway, we may as well help them get out. Because here's a key thing. When this was happening in 68, 69, many of these men were still missing in action. They hadn't been reported as POWs yet. So all the POWs were doing everything they can to memorize as many names, each other's names. We're talking dozens of names, so that if anyone ever did get out, they could go back and report who was being held, who had been held. So the Americans, the room 6 cellmates, their attitude is, we think you're going to fail as soon as you get over the wall because you've got nowhere to go, but we're going to help you anyway because maybe this is our only chance to let someone know we're there. But that knowledge that, or the belief, I guess I should say, that they would fail as soon as they got over the wall was what drove so much of the conflict. Again, I refer you to Articles 3 and 4 of the Code of Conduct. I will make every attempt to escape, but I will take no action that will bring harm to my fellow prisoners. And then there was Dramisi's plan. They just didn't think he could succeed. Most of the guys in the cell would say, we knew how to get out of the cell. We knew how to get out of the building. We knew we could get over the wall. After that, you've got to go 4+ miles from us to the Red River, through Hanoi, during the Vietnam War, when Americans are hated, Westerners are hated, with no outside help. They just didn't believe it could succeed. As Bill Ball once said, you get over the wall, you get someone waiting there to pick you up, great. But if not, what are you going to do? You're all screwed. So for months, even as they were planning, there was perpetual fighting. And I cover these months in detail in the book, some of the anecdotes and stories that went down. But I want to share 2 particular anecdotes with you. At one point, the Vietnamese issued the men new blankets. Dramisi wanted to claim the blankets as props for the escape because he had an idea. You could take the straw from brooms, and they had plenty of brooms. Brooms weren't a problem. The men were expected to keep their cells and their courtyards neat swept, and they were used on sweeping details out in the main area often. They had plenty of brooms. Take straw from the brooms, push them through the blankets to make little camouflage blankets that would look like a bed of grass. So if you're laying on the ground, it looks like a grassy hump. Okay. Well, the men wanted the blankets for the winter. They didn't, and they thought the whole idea was stupid and it wouldn't work. So while Dramisi commandeers the blankets, and while him and Atterbury make their blankets and they're testing them within their cell, the other men are making fun of them. Don, do you see anything? Nope, I don't see anything. Bill, do you see anything? Nope, I don't see anything. Another one was the bucket. Now you can see this bucket on the screen with a couple of flip-flops. Those flip-flops are called zaps. That's what the Americans called their Vietnamese issued flip-flops. And what you were looking there is a POW toilet. Rusty old bucket, a lid sitting on the floor behind it. And when you went to sit on it, you sat on your zaps. And 9 men shared 4 of these buckets and no other privacy, and just some paper, cardboard-like toilet paper that the Vietnamese issued them. Well, each summer, actually all the time, especially in the winter, these buckets every day would get filled up. Diet of rice, you're trapped in a cell, you've got nowhere to go. And by the end of the day, the men would be peeing into floor vents in the floor that would lead to the outside. Well, they were complaining. Finally, the Vietnamese gave them a new bucket. Nice, shiny, brand new, never used bucket with a nice lid that fit on there securely. Dramisi claimed it. He wanted to use it for carrying water after they escaped. Big fight ensued. But he was the SRO. It was his escape plan, and it was his bucket. I want to rewind for a second here. I realized I skipped over a key detail earlier when I talked about code names. The reason why the escape was codenamed the Party, and these 2 men were called the Party Dolls, was once the POWs had the ability to pass notes cell to cell, they needed the code names. If any man, if the Vietnamese ever intercepted any note, the escape was not an escape, it was a party the men were planning for after their release someday, and the Party Dolls were the women they were going to invite to the party, and that was the code name. Okay, another code name here had an important twist in the story. Connie Troutman's code name in note passing was Twitty. I mentioned a few minutes ago, all the POWs were expected to memorize as many names as humanly possible of all the POWs that were in there, so that if for any reason when they got out, they could say who was there, who was not missing in action. No, this man was a prisoner. One day, the men of room 6 get a note from another cell saying that if the Vietnamese ever ask who is Twitty, Connie Troutman's code name, it's Ed Davis. Ed Davis was a POW in another cell. The POWs were trying to protect Troutman by using a cover name for his code name. Well, according to the men of room 6, that note comes in, and Dramisi looks around and says, well, who's Ed Davis? The other POWs were pissed. It was his job to know who Ed Davis was. This was another POW right in another cell nearby. He was supposed to be memorizing these names so he could take them with him when he got out. And instead, he had no idea who he was. And worse, the POWs said, Dramisi seemed miffed that the other guys were angry or laughing at him for not knowing who Ed Davis was. And this seemed to be the tipping point. By all accounts, it was somewhere around May 2nd, Friday, May 2nd, 1969, that Connie Troutman came out into his courtyard in the morning after the guards left. He got his note out of the crack in the wall, and he used to take it into their outhouse to read it so he could drop it into the hole when he was done reading it. He didn't drop it into the hole when he was done. Instead, he came out of the outhouse, and as Mike McGrath said, he looked aghast. And he said, guys, you got to read this. And they all took turns, took the note into the toilet and read it. The note was from room 5. It wasn't signed by Dramisi. Dramisi was room 6's note writer. He didn't write it. It was signed the escape committee, and it revealed the year of conflict, how Dramisi wasn't really the SRO, that it was really Red Wilson, how Dramisi wasn't making plans for the whole camp. He was making plans for himself and Atterbury, how he wasn't memorizing the names, how he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't listening to anyone else's inputs, how this was a one-man show. So Connie Troutman, good military man who was in shock. He believed every officer had honor, wouldn't lie to him. He was shocked and dismayed. He sends a note back to room 6 that strips Dramisi of the SRO, puts Red Wilson in charge, and cancels the escape for lack of outside help. In fact, he says there will be no escape without outside help. As Bilbao told me at the time, Dramisi fumed and Red Wilson remained stony, but the rest of their room was happy with that arrangement when that was done. So now the escape is off. Red's in charge. Dramisi's unhappy. And just days later, May 10th, 1969, it's a Saturday night, and here come the thunderstorms, and the power goes out. And somebody in the cell says, boy, I'm glad this escape is off, because this would be the perfect night for it. And as Bilbao would say, it sure would. Dramisi says, well, I think we should go anyway. Put me in the ceiling. He wanted to get up into the ceiling so he could talk to Connie Troutman in room 5, because the wall between the cells went all the way up through the attic into the ceiling, but there were gaps up in there where someone in the attic in room 5 could talk to someone in room 6 or vice versa. So Troutman gets tap code on his wall saying Dramisi wants to come up into the ceiling and talk to him. Troutman has someone in his cell boost him up, not into the ceiling, but just up to the vent, the barbed wire covered vent. And Dramisi's up in the ceiling, and they have a conversation. Troutman tells Dramisi, I'm not giving you permission to go, but I'm not telling you you can't. It's up to you. Dramisi says, we're going anyway. He never comes back down into the cell. He calls down into the cell, has Atterbury sent up. They start getting all their materials together, and the escape happens. One man said, I was actually aghast that I didn't think it would ever go down. In fact, multiple men said, we didn't actually think it would ever happen. We thought the planning was a good idea, but we didn't think Dramisi would ever actually get permission to go. And here it was happening on no notice. The party had begun. So once again, you see Porter Halliburton's sketch drawing on the left. And this time I show the path out of the cell and over the wall. Dramisi and Atterbury got up onto the ceiling, got up into the attic. They drank their water. They got all their supplies together that they'd hidden in the attic. They worked the tiles free up on the roof, and they climbed off. Their original plan was to shimmy down the lightning rod that had been, every building there had a lightning rod, but that had been or charged by the thunderstorm, I'm sorry. So instead they tied a homemade rope they had to that and shimmied down. They then scurried their way across the courtyard in the rain. And at the far end, at the top of the screen there, you can see it's marked garden and there's a little square there. That square was an outhouse the guards used against the wall. All part of their plan. They got up on the outhouse. They used one of their straw broom blankets, drape it over the barbed wire. I had mentioned that Ed Atterbury was a telephone lineman early in his day. He had taken a piece of some sort of metal or wire and bent it so that he could drop it over the electrified wire on top of the barbed wire, shorting that out. And the short of it is they were able to get over the wall out of the camp. Once they were over the wall, they put on their disguises and took off right down the road. They went for a few hours. Dramisi said they kind of lost track of time. They were getting worried. They thought it might be light soon. So they found an old Christian church, an abandoned Christian church. He said steeple, the whole works, but it was abandoned, boarded up. And so they crawled into some into shrub or bramble around the outside of it and went to sleep there before dawn on the morning of May 11th, 1969. When they awoke, the Vietnamese soldiers were already tearing apart the church, and within minutes they were recaptured. They were hauled back to the zoo, the main prison adjacent to the annex. But even by the time that had happened, the jig was already up. There had been no head start all the way to Monday morning. As Don Heiliger told me, 5:30 in the morning, their cell door pops open, and one of their mean guards, not the Sunday substitute they expected, is there. And very carefully, he has them all get up and takes a head count. And when he realizes there's 2 men missing, he asks Heiliger, where did they go? And he just said, they left. It wasn't long thereafter. Bill Baugh and Don Heiliger were the first 2 men taken out of the cell. I'm going to back up on the cell here. You can see the numbered rooms here. You see the one building that's labeled quiz room. That was the building, a 2-cell building where the Vietnamese did their torture and interrogations. Baugh and Heiliger were dragged off there, and that's when it all hit the fan. By the time this was happening, Dramisi and Atterbury were already back at the zoo. But that wasn't the end of the ordeal. For the next 2 weeks, every man in room 6 and men in other cells were all taken and tortured to get the truth of the escape. And I hope everyone's taking a good hard look at these 2 drawings on here. These are drawings from Mike McGrath's book and from mine, used with permission. This illustrates the ropes. And I kind of saved this for weight. Of all the torture that Americans would go through, the ropes was probably the most horrific thing. And I'll describe it for you while you're looking at the images. The way it would start was they would tie your wrists together behind your back with lots of rope tied, or iron manacles. Maybe they were manacled together. Then behind your back, they would tie your elbows together, tight, pull them absolutely tight. Then they would start lifting your arms up over your head, usually until your shoulder is dislocated. Then they'd run that rope down to the iron manacles or ropes you were wearing on your feet. You were manacled sitting there. Run the rope through that, pull it tight so it forced your head down between your legs. Then they tie the rope around your neck, so tight you could barely breathe, so tight you could barely get circulation. Then the beatings and the questions would start, maybe. Sometimes they just leave you that way to let you think about your situation. Or sometimes it'll make you listen like that while they tortured someone else. Every man in room 6 went through that. Every man in room 5 went through that. Damn near every man in the annex went through that. At least all the senior ranking men in each room. The way they would work is they'd ask you a specific set of questions and they would work on you until they got the answers they want. Then they'd go to the next guy and ask them the same questions. And they would work on him until his answers matched with yours. Then they'd go to the next guy and do the same thing to him. And so anytime your answers didn't match someone else's, you got it worse. Or if they didn't match yours, they got it worse. And in that way, the North Vietnamese broke. Every man involved learned every detail of the escape, learned every detail of the prisoners' communications network within the annex, and they even learned that the annex was communicating with the zoo. There was a way for room 5 to communicate with people on the other side of the wall in the annex just by using tap code, flashing signals, no written notes or anything like that. But because the zoo prisoners were higher ranking than the annex prisoners, and the Vietnamese knew that the prisoners would organize themselves by rank, once they realized there was communication with the zoo, they started torturing the zoo prisoners. And some of the prisoners in the zoo, now, the zoo didn't know anything about the escape until the annex passed word on the morning of the escape. They didn't know any details. They didn't know who it was, what had happened, how it was planned, nothing. All they knew was quick tap code, escape in progress on the morning of May 11th. In the days that would come, when that information was tortured out of the Americans, they began torturing the zoo prisoners. They were sure, the North Vietnamese were sure that the zoo knew about the escape, and they didn't. They were sure the senior zoo prisoners approved it. They didn't. The men in the zoo were tortured for information they did not have, but the North Vietnamese were sure they did. They had no way to give the right answer, even if they knew it. And so they suffered horribly. The Americans would come to call this Mad Dog Season. It was the entire summer of 1969. By the time all the Americans had been tortured, the truth had come out. About 2 weeks after that, they were sent back to their cells. They were all put in leg irons. They were all sentenced to 6 months of half rations, as in they wore their leg irons 24/7. In fact, there were so many Americans, the leg irons that the North Vietnamese ran out of them, and they started chaining the Americans together. Ironically, Bill Baugh and Red Wilson, who had been best friends for years before they ended up in the annex, were chained together. Can you imagine having to go to the bathroom in a bucket with a guy chained to your ankle right next to you? Horrible, horrible. But this is how they lived in the summer of '69 after the escape. Dramisi, when he was brought back to the zoo, he stayed at the zoo where he was tortured for estimated 38 days, he says, and then eventually he was transferred to the Hanoi Hilton, where they kept the higher value prisoners, and he would stay there for the rest of his time in Hanoi. And that's kind of the story of the escape. By October 1969, the Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader, died in September of '69. And in October, the leg irons came off all the prisoners. They started getting improved treatment. And in the next few years, their treatment continued to improve as the war wore on. In 1970, the Vietnamese consolidated all the prisoners in camps around Hanoi so they could have them all centralized, not scattered in more camps, which forced all the Americans, or forced the Vietnamese to hold them all together. Now you're talking, instead of 9 guys to a cell, 40 to 50 guys. This was a huge morale boost for the Americans. They received better treatment. That would continue. It's still POWs, but they were no longer tortured, no longer beaten, until February 1973, when Operation Homecoming brought 566 American POWs, plus a couple dozen foreign nationals home. This image here, by the way, with Bill Baugh reuniting with his wife Mary after almost 7 years. I'm not going to mess up now, and I'll tell you all, this is probably the first time I've ever looked at this image and not got all messed it up. Well, everyone came home, of course, except for Ed Atterbury, and you're wondering what happened to him. As I mentioned, they were recaptured the next day. They were put in a Jeep, blindfolded, tied up, brought back to the zoo. Before they were taken out of the zoo, Dramisi said Atterbury shook his hand and said, "Well, we tried." Al Meyer reported hearing them being tortured in the zoo, where Al Meyer was being tortured. And the last reported sighting of Atterbury was May 14th. According to the North Vietnamese, sometime later, they said he died May 18th of a mysterious disease. Of course, no American believes that. According to everything we could piece together, no one knows for sure, but he was almost certainly died in torture, probably in the ropes, whether it was at the zoo or the Hanoi Hilton. Bill Baugh believed he died in the ropes, that he choked to death, because, as Baugh told me, they used to put you in the ropes and then they'd leave you alone for a while. And after the day after the recapture, they would no longer leave you alone. They would always leave someone in the room with you. Another POW thinks Atterbury got a chance to kill himself. He thinks he was able to take his porcelain water cup, break it up into shards in a moment when he was left alone, and somehow slice his wrists. That's possible too. But every POW pretty much in the entire POW community believes that Atterbury died in torture afterward. His remains were repatriated in March of 1974, and shortly thereafter, he was laid to rest in a Texas cemetery with other members of his family. He was promoted posthumously to lieutenant colonel, and that's his fate. That's the story, folks. That's the story. So I want to leave you with one thought. When I worked for Bill Baugh, I was young, 20, single guy. If you remember what you were like in your 20s, your worldview and your mindset is a lot different than it is as you're older. Lots of pettiness, lots of melodrama. And I remember coming into work, grumping about this or grumping about that. And Bill would just look at me, laugh, and say, "There's no such thing as a bad day." And that was also one of his mottos when he gave his talks around town. He'd usually wrap it up. And for me, it resonates because there's nothing that can happen to all of these men, all of these men that can compare to my daily life. So there's no such thing as a bad day in my world. So if you're interested in the book, it's also available as a podcast, a 10-episode podcast at thepartydolls.com. What is great about the podcast is it's basically me reading the book, but wherever possible, I use the actual audio from the POWs I interviewed 25, 30 years ago. So you can get out there and hear Don Heiliger tell his story, Bill Baugh. John Dramisi tells the actual escape himself. So that's all I have. I'd like to turn it back to Eric now with sincere thanks and questions from anyone.
I can't imagine how difficult it was to write that book. Just looking at that last picture that you showed of Bill Baugh reuniting with his wife, you know, that hit me really hard. You're the one who had to do all this research. I can't imagine this project didn't keep you up at nights.
Keep me up nights? Oh yeah, it did. Life changing. This is a very, very humbling story to tell.
I can imagine. I can definitely imagine. If you could drop your screen share, George, and I will bring up some of the questions that received from the audience.
Boom.
Perfect.
They in chat? We in chat?
I'm gonna bring up a PowerPoint.
Okay, cool.
The first question, George, is why did it matter who was in charge at a POW camp? What was the importance of having those senior ranking officers designated as in charge?
Well, anytime you have military people together in an official capacity, someone has to be in charge. It really is that simple. And the rank structure, in fact, I write in the book, you know, if you thrust any group of military people together, even in some social settings, the first thing they'll do is figure out who is in charge. If you've got two men in a cell, one man outranks the other. And if it's a military environment, this isn't buddies. You know, one man is in charge, makes decisions. And they were mandated to do that, whether it was two men in one cell, whether you had, if you could communicate with another cell, who's a senior ranking person there? If you can communicate with the building, who's a senior ranking person there? It's just part of the military structure. Someone has to be in charge.
Right. Move on to the next question. I'm going to do advance here. Please advance. Were the articles of the prisoners that you were talking about, were they only applicable during the Vietnam War, or were these articles and codes in place during previous conflicts?
They were written after the Korean War, ironically, but they are still in place today. In fact, because of the shortcomings, the conflict that was identified, they revised them after the Vietnam War, but they were first written after the Korean War. John Dramisi told me, interestingly, that they were written because they were written primarily with enlisted guys like me. You know, the soldiers who were they were the ones that were captured and taken prisoner during Korea. It was more enlisted guys and soldiers. So the code of conduct was written with them in mind, and they didn't really take into account the circumstances that Vietnam would present. In fact, I'll even add the one thing they changed in the code of conduct was one of the articles said you were bound to give only name, rank, and serial number, and they changed the word required because they felt that bound. An interesting point was every single man was tortured to the point of breaking. Every single man was tortured to the point where they gave more than name, rank, and serial number. You couldn't help it. The only way you could avoid not breaking was either death or unconsciousness. And if you went unconscious, they'd just wake you up and start all over again, right? There was no resisting to the end unless you died. So every man broke. And at what point do you decide, you know, who broke too soon, who broke too late, who broke a rule, who didn't? It's inhumane to expect them to go through all of that and only give name, rank, and serial number. So after the Vietnam War, they changed the wording of the code of conduct so that the men were no longer bound to only give name, rank, and serial number. They were required. And it was felt that gave them the moral wiggle room because these men would literally come out of torture. They would come out of torture morally destroyed because they felt they had betrayed their country in torture.
Let's see, move on to the next question here, George. How long did it take you to find and contact the POWs that you talked about in your book?
The only hard one really was John Dramisi. I mentioned early on Mike McGrath from Room 5, who lived here. He and Bill Ball were good friends, and they were neighbors, and that's how I met Mike. But at the time, Mike was president of NAM Pows, and even today, he's still on their board of directors and is their historian. So he was able to put me in touch with every single living POW at the time. This was probably around 1998 is when I started putting all this together, where I reached out to everyone I could find. And Dramisi was actually, to put it in POW terms, he was a black sheep. He didn't attend all their reunions. He didn't keep in touch with any of them. His book, he bashed the entire POW universe and pretty much became ostracized after that. And I was still with Airman Magazine at the time when I tracked him down, and it took a couple phone calls and a couple letters before I finally got him to agree to an interview. But yeah, all the rest of them, it wasn't hard at all. Yeah.
Okay, we just got a question in that I didn't get slipped into the PowerPoint, so I'll go back to the PowerPoint in a second. But the question that we just got posed is, were there any ramifications to Vietnam for not reporting POWs in violation of international law?
No, not ramifications per se, but that's really a great question, because it brings up a good point. As far as the torture and all the other abuses that the Americans went through at the hands of the North Vietnamese were always quick to point out to the Americans, your government has never declared war on us. Geneva Conventions do not apply to you because you're not a prisoner of war. You're a criminal and an air pilot guilty of illegally bombing our country. You don't have any rights.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
How did the POWs know so much about, what was going on outside their camp, and particularly some of the maps you were showing, especially the one where it showed the 4-mile stretch where they had to walk down the Red River to get from Hanoi to the coast. And it had all the other camps on there. How did they how did they have so much information and were able to put this together after they came back home?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, most of that information was put together after they got home. For instance, I showed the one grainy aerial photo of the annex. That was actually taken during the war. It was an intel photo. As far as like the distance to the Red River, that was actually a point of huge conflict among the men of Room 6. The men of Room 6 couldn't even agree on exactly where the annex was. They didn't know where it was in Hanoi at the time. They didn't find out till after the fact. So Dramisi thought it was very close to the river, and other people thought it was further away than it was. So that was actually one of the things they fought about. Was there's a line in the book. Glenn Wilson yells at Dramisi, "You don't even know where the hell you are. How are you going to get out of here?" Right? Most of the information, actually all of the information they found was after the fact. While they were, for instance, they didn't even realize the annex was directly connected to the zoo until many months after they were moved there.
So basically, they did not have that information while they were, in these prison camps, and it was only put together afterwards, the larger picture.
Correct, absolutely correct. Even when they were moved from camp to camp, they were always blindfolded. They really didn't know the lay of the land after the fact. Another interesting point, some of them might have had an idea. Al Meyer from Room 6 told me that before he got shot down, he had attended a briefing where they showed intel photos showing where the various prison camps were. And he admitted, I didn't pay too much attention to it. I didn't ever think I'd be there. And boy, I wish I had paid attention.
Yeah, I can imagine.
In fact, if I may, another point as far as what they knew, let's harken back to the code of conduct. They didn't have access to the code of conduct while they were there. They were only reciting what they could remember, which made more conflict because Dramisi, and I'm using one of their words, could hammer them over the obligation to escape, but none of them could quote back exactly what the next article said. You're not supposed to do this because it's breaking faith with us.
Mm.
What they really knew there, this book shows, and this, we know a lot more now than what they knew when they were living this.
Sure. Yeah. And I can see how that would definitely create conflict if, you know, you had, it would be like having competing orders, basically.
Very much. Yes. Yep.
Was it commonplace that POWs would think of themselves, you know, rather than the welfare of the whole, as Dramisi seems to do in this story?
No, unity. In fact, that's part of the conflict. Was the unity of all of them was utmost to them. That's Dramisi and his drive to escape, in many of their views, was a breaking of that unity. You're causing us harm for your own glory. As many of them said, you know, they felt he was only doing it for the medal, so he could say he tried to escape. There's a layer of nuance to this. There's a passage in the book where I talk about one of the POWs tells me that, you know, during the Vietnam War, there was an attitude among many pilots as this is a time to spruce up your resume, if you will. Go get some air kills, go get some combat missions, so that later on you look good for promotion. And as one of the guys in room 6 said, while all these other guys are racking up their general officer endorsements for promotion, we were worried about emptying our toilet buckets. You know, so the guys on the outside were you know, able to continue their careers, while the guys on the inside were stuck together. And I realized I just kind of wandered off the whole unity point, but
it speaks to it, you know, in kind of a roundabout way. It definitely speaks to it.
Yes. Yep. But yeah, unity over self, the big drive. Oh, that was it. The argument against Dramisi was a lot of them were just convinced that he was only doing it for the personal glory. And interestingly, a question, since nobody really knew Atterbury, and I don't explore this much in the presentation, was nobody could really understand why Atterbury went with him. Part of it, I speculate, was I don't think the North Vietnamese realized he was a spy plane pilot. I think they thought he was an F-4 pilot, a general aviator. If you looked at his resume, you think about if he did Cold War spy missions in Europe, if he overflew the Cuban Missile Crisis, if he's flown multiple spy planes throughout his career, he would have known the capabilities of all those aircraft. He would have known the types of spy missions. He would have known the capabilities of the surveillance equipment he was using. He should have been a high value intelligence asset, not only to the North Vietnamese, but to their communist allies. I personally don't think the Vietnamese ever realized who Atterbury was. And I think part of the reason why he wanted to escape was to prevent them from knowing that.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like it would make sense. And we just had a former Cold War spy plane lecture just a couple of weeks ago too, with Gary Francis Powers Jr.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, that kind of all just gels together. If you were in that sort of position, they didn't know about it, you would want to get out before they did find out.
Right.
For sure.
Right. So you can say, you know, Atterbury had his own personal motivations too, but his were more, I think his might have been preservation instead of glory.
Well, that's all the questions that we have. George, it was a fantastic talk, and it definitely gives us pause for thought about what these gentlemen endured, you know, during their time in these prisoner of war camps. I don't want to say we hear about it all the time, but, you know, in a sense, we do hear about these situations quite often, especially with the profession that we're in at the museum. But to have it detailed like you do in the book, it really hits home. And it, like I said in the beginning of my comments, it makes it a very difficult subject to not only talk about, but to spend many years writing and researching about. Kudos to you and your newest work. And it was definitely an excellent presentation as well. Thank you
so much. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here too. I'm truly humbled to tell this story. Truly humbled.
And I would like to thank everybody for showing up today and joining us for our book talk. Like I said, this is our last one for the month of August, but please go to our website and look at our schedule for the upcoming months throughout the remainder of the year. We do have a full schedule of virtual events coming up from now until the end of 2021, and of course, continuing into 2022. So you can find all that at our website, whizbetsmuseum.com. And like I said, we'd like to thank everybody for coming out. George, thank you again for being with us today and for talking with us. And I wish everybody has a great rest of the Monday and a good end of your August. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.